Welcome to Text on Text. This is Jed Sundwall. This month we're talking to Jordan Tigani about a Jorge Luis Borges story, or rather essay, called The Analytical Language of John Wilkins. Jordan is the CEO of a company called Mother Duck, and he's a real gem. I'm so glad to know him, and I'm so glad that he recommended this essay to me. I'd never read it before. I was not familiar with it, and I just absolutely loved it. So much so that upon reading it, I decided I was going to assign it to the students that I'm teaching this semester at Yale. I did this because I think this story does a tremendous job of explaining how humans use language to encode information, what the limits of that are, and what the potential of that could be. It's a very short essay. If you haven't read it, just go ahead and read it. We're going to go through it pretty thoroughly in this discussion, but this is just a phenomenal piece of writing, and I absolutely loved it. It's a really weird thing. It's part history, part essay, part fiction. Borges just makes some stuff up for the essay, and just a remarkable piece of writing, and I'm so glad I read it. And I just want to thank Jordan right at the top. I'm going to thank him at the end too for being on the podcast, but this was just a real joy for me, so I hope you enjoy it. All right, Jordan, welcome to Text on Text. Do you mind introducing yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me on, Jed. Great to chat. So I'm Jordan Tigani. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Mother Duck. I've been a longtime software engineer, database person, and built analytical systems, which I think is interesting. We're going to be talking about an analytical language or an essay on analytical language in this podcast.
Oh, it's so great. I'm really excited about this one. Before we start talking about the essay, I have to ask you, and this is very silly to ask you this for anyone who knows anything about your career. Are you a technologist?
To the extent that I know what that word means, yes, I am a technologist. I've been a software engineer. I was actually writing code probably for 20 years out of my career, and as a product manager, building technology. So I guess that would mean I'm a technologist.
Yes, I think so. I don't know. This is sort of the joke of the podcast. I think anyone who's like really built anything or uses tools as a technology in some way is a technologist. To some degree. So, okay. But yes, I think
somebody that I knew put technologist on his resume, and like recruiters and I was trying to hire this person, and the recruiter was like, he's a technologist. What does that actually mean? Like, can he write code? Is he a developer? And he was trying to say, well, what I can do is sort of broader than just coding. But so that's why I don't necessarily know if I can be a technologist, because I feel like that's sort of a higher level of being or thinking about technology.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, so I had on the podcast George Dyson, who he's an historian of technology, but then he also makes boats. He's really into like making kayaks and stuff, and he's like, oh yeah, I'm absolutely a technologist. Like I make boats. Like they're a very like primitive, potentially primitive, however you want to characterize it, but like a very important technology for human development. And so it's like, I guess it's like anybody who builds tools or thinks about building tools, which, yeah, you're a technologist. You can put that on your resume. So, okay. All right. So we're talking about the analytical language of John Wilkins. This is a great one because, as I've been on this podcast talking about Borges, we've done 2 episodes about Borges already, and I've been telling people to buy the Collected Fictions book. This is not in that book. It's an essay. Can you tell me why you thought about this story for the podcast?
Yeah, sure.
It's not a story. It's an essay, but yeah.
Yeah. First of all, I even talking about Borges feels like somewhat pretentious. Like it's sort of like people that, they talk about going to Paris.
Right.
Like it's just, I think because like, there's not a really English way, pronunciation of it. When you say it, it sounds,
yeah.
The only one that's worse is probably Goethe. Right. Like you just have to, mold your mouth in saying it. And anyway, so and also like relatively, I wouldn't say obscure, but since he really only wrote short stories and essays, like
Yeah.
people, it feels a little bit pretentious to talk about him. On the other hand, like so many great stories and so many things that just sort of make you think in sort of different ways and kind of expand your mind. And so the reason I thought about this one was, I think partly as a technologist and somebody who likes, to build stuff. There's, from an essay written in the 1940s, there's like just so many interesting things that actually directly are like related to things that I actually work on, and as well as like there's like this part of it where he has this this taxonomy that is just it's one of those things that just sort of sticks with you, and I those that belong to the emperor is just something that like I sort of tend to sort of come back to over and over again, and just sort of the absurdity of ontologies and how they're hard to make work. Anyway, there's just so many things that are related to my career. But then I think the thing that I saw this in, so I read like through his like collected fictions, and then somebody referenced this one. I remember very early on in Google days, like so when Google basically seemed like it was just this sort of magical, they used to call it the chocolate factory in this this one internet website that was like, they call them the Oompa Loompas in the chocolate factory, because it was this sort of like this magic stuff that comes out of them. And and out of Google Labs came this like sets thing where you could put in like one or two elements of some set, and it would come up with the rest of them. And so like I think there was a reporter who kind of put in basically two of the things from this taxonomy, from this, and like it fill out the rest. And I think that was my first encounter with it, and it was just so interesting. And I'm like, I had to go out and sort of find it and read it. And I think since then it's sort of like it shows up in a bunch of different places, like the Cryptonomicon from Neil Stephenson referenced it, and like you can kind of see echoes of it various places.
Okay. Yeah, that's a Stevenson book I haven't read. In fact, I think I've only read Snow Crash.
Probably the best one. So you're good with that one. But
oh, really? Okay. I don't know. I've been told like I have to read the Diamond Age. I've been told I have to read whatever. I can't even say it. Cryptonomicron.
Actually, no. I think the Diamond Age was the one that actually I think is the best one. But then I think Cryptonomicon is also pretty good.
Okay. All right. Well, eventually.
And he's a local Seattleite.
Yeah, I know this. So he is on my radar, and like Ted Chiang also lives on the East Side. Yeah, somehow I want to track these guys down, and because Ted Chiang, I think I worked at Microsoft or something at some point. Like he's written software, so he's a tech who can talk about text and writes text. So. Okay. Well, I have to thank you for recommending this essay. I had not read it, and yeah, it's a delight. And I also have to like, unfortunately agree with you, like how pretentious it is to talk about Borges. Like I always say like even this podcast has an intentionally goofy name because I want it to be unserious. And, I don't know if I'm pulling that off by talking about Borges so much, but like, it's a very approachable essay. It doesn't take a long time to read. And I think it's a good example of really how funny Borges is. Like he's always just kind of like, just laughing at the universe. So yeah, let's go through it. Do you want to explain it, or do you want me to try to explain it?
Yeah, maybe I can give sort of, he starts off kind of talking about how this John Wilkins character was cut out of the encyclopedia, which I also thought was really, anyway, before I dig into that, but he then kind of talks about like this this John Wilkins, person who wrote a 600-page essay on self-describing analytical language, and that it part of that was basically creating a taxonomy that, in order to make the language self-describing, basically everything had to come out of these categories, and you could put these things together and in ways that then, given a word, you should be able to know what it meant. And I think he sort of thinks it's a little bit absurd. Borges thinks it's a little bit absurd, and kind of proposes, compares it to this, this, what is emporium of celestial beings or something, that is this taxonomy of animals that is entirely absurd. He's a little bit tongue in cheek. Like, he doesn't, like, it's not entirely, clear that he's sort of making fun of things when he's making fun of things, until you sort of like, actually think about it a little bit more.
Yeah.
I think that's sort of my high level summary. I mean, does anything I missed?
No. I mean, that's right. It's basically, I mean, there's this immediate joke, which is this idea that, like, did Borges really, like, go to the encyclopedia and be like, wait, where's the article on John Wilkins? Like, it's hilarious. I mean, evidently this may have happened. I mean, here's the other thing I guess I would point out at this point, is that, like, John Wilkins really was a person in the 1600s who did try to do this. Like, Borges did his homework on this, and it's fascinating to me that Borges, like, even was aware of this guy, and then was also like doing a diff on the encyclopedias when they came out in 1940 somehow.
Yeah, that seems hilarious to me. Just like, that not only would somebody actually read the encyclopedia, but then just sort of notice, like, oh, what is different in this encyclopedia, and what is missing. I guess it's an interesting cultural thing to sort of to see. Okay, what is now no longer important that used to be important, and because certainly, like, people look at what has showed up that is new in the encyclopedia, but those kinds of things tend to be sort of like maybe more obvious. But
right.
The things that are dropped are also tells you something about, what's not important anymore.
Yeah. No, it's I'm reminded right now of the on exactitude in science, which is, I did another episode about this a few months ago, which is this half-page story, I'm doing air quotes, about the empire that built a 1-to-1 map, right? And then they're like, this is dumb. We can't have this map covering everything, so we're just going to tear it up and get rid of it. But there's this sort of throwaway line. It's just like, yeah, and then that empire, like, they just didn't think about cartography anymore. Like, it just wasn't interesting to them anymore. And it's this really funny and weird line, which is the idea that, like, yeah, like, humans could decide at any point that they're like, we just don't want to interpret the world this way anymore. Like, that's what he's saying. And, like, that's the interesting thing about John Wilkins, and what, like, the case he's making in this essay is that, like, look, it's fine. Like, that the encyclopedia entry about him wasn't very good in the first place, but, like, just FYI, he worked on a really crazy idea that could have reshaped how we perceive the universe. And I guess we just don't care about that anymore. So we'll just delete him from the encyclopedia.
And if this was, I think another sort of interesting thing was that, this was, a 600-page treatise that this guy wrote on, like, that, and it wasn't just writing, it was like having to sort of figure out how do you build the ontology and the taxonomy of the universe, and sort of all things that we can talk about or describe. Really kind of, I mean, that's a ton of work. And that Borges said that he couldn't get a copy of it in Argentina. Like, the National Library didn't have a copy of it.
Yeah.
And if you actually compare that to today, like, I was able to get a copy of it on the Internet Archive. And so I can just download a copy. Wow. Like, it took me 30 seconds to, like, find and download something that, like, Borges couldn't even do. in his, you couldn't find this in Argentina.
Amazing. Yeah, yeah. I guess everything he writes here, he says he reads, he has all these secondary sources that he used to write the essay. Incredible. Yeah, I didn't realize it was still around.
And I feel actually like this is sort of like, he was sort of like the equivalent of like an open source like maintainer, or somebody who's like, who works on, I mean, because he's building this language, he's spending all this time and energy building something that he doesn't know that anybody's going to use. He hopes that somebody's going to do it, and it's sort of must be a labor of love, kind of a passion project. And I think just like some open source projects take off and some of them don't, this one turned out to sort of not.
Right.
I think it would have been consigned to the dustbins of history probably if Borges hadn't remarked on it.
Yeah, yeah. It's incredible. So I'm going to go ahead and read a little bit about the language just to frame it. And yeah, you referred to the Chinese encyclopedia when we have to read that list as well. So I'm going to read the description of Wilkins's language. So the idea was, this guy, he's like, we're going to create a language that, you use the term like self-describing, in the sense that like it's able to create symbols or words for anything in the universe based on like a mechanism that he's designed. And so here it goes. It says he divided the universe into 40 categories or genera, these being further subdivided into differences, which were subdivided into species. He assigned to each genus a monosyllable of 2 letters, to each difference a consonant, to each species a vowel. For example, de, de, which means an element, DEB, the first of the elements, fire, DEBA, a part of the element fire, a flame. So I won't go on from there, but it's already immediately very funny to me. It's like, there are 40 main categories of the universe, right? And then everyone knows there are elements, and everyone knows that the first element is fire. It's like, just like, I don't know. From my perspective, this seems like entirely wrong on its face. Mm-hmm. But of course, I mean, like, I don't know what it was like in the 1600s. This guy was clearly very ambitious. And also, why not? Yeah, over to you. Like, just curious to get your thoughts on this.
I guess it reminds me a little bit of, there's a data structure in software called a trie, TRIE. And it basically, the idea is you can sort of find anything. You basically start with kind of, all the letters of the alphabet, so A to Z, and then sort of under, D would have a pointer to, the next line is A through Z, and then you can, so like DE would be, so DE, and then DEB and DEBA. Would be sort of elements of this trie. And I guess the interesting thing is that sort of each one of these things then has a meaning associated with it.
Right.
First of all, it's sort of like, it's kind of compacting a lot of knowledge into a short, a small amount. On the other hand, like it's, when you overcompact knowledge, then you run the risk of transmission errors. So, and I think that's sort of one of the things that actually has been a criticism of this analytical language, is that if you don't understand exactly what someone is saying, 2 very similar words or very different words can sound very, very similar. And I think English, and so most human languages have that same problem. On the other hand, because they have evolved over centuries, they're resilient to some of those those confusions. Homophones exist, but in general, like, they're different enough that that context is enough to be able to sort of disambiguate that, and sort of in a language that is created kind of out of whole cloth is most likely going to be much less resistant, and there may be a lot more of these sort of very, very similar pairs that might be very hard to actually be able to disambiguate.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, thinking about, I think we should actually just go through the essay, not necessarily line by line, but section by section to go through this, because I'm tempted to skip ahead to a lot of the other points that he makes. But thinking about this in terms of software and how we write software and build at least digital technologies these days, it is really interesting to think about things like metadata standards or just patterns of writing software that are so similar to, kind of to your point, like how language evolves. And then also how language is like governed in a way, especially those of us like English speakers, where like English is just like a completely emergent, ungoverned, weird language. There's nothing like, I think in both in France and Spain, they have like an academy that attempts to kind of define what is and is not French or Spanish. Whereas in English and in software, it's just kind of wild and emergent. And to your point, it allows us to figure out collaboratively somehow conventions that are functional, like at least they work. So,
and I think the structure of language or the structure of written language can add additional properties. I mean, so he's trying to add sort of meaning to the language and the structure of language. But if you think about like phonetic languages or phonetic written languages, it's actually a pretty big innovation to be able to sort of look at a word and be able to, something you may not have seen before, and be able to know how to say it. You look at so a lot of Eastern languages that are pictographic languages, to some extent, I think you can know what they mean by the pictographs, but you may not know how. Like you have to basically memorize, how to say it. So sort of like taking it as sort of a step further and saying like, hey, I'm going to be able to build up from basic elements, build up a language that is self-describing, or you can tell what it means, tell what a word means just from looking at it is interesting.
That's very interesting. Yeah, no, that actually hadn't occurred to me. Thinking about this is the fact that we're speaking right now a language that is like very attuned to phonetics and the ability of like most people to be able to make sounds that other people can hear and parse, whereas a lot of other written languages historically have not had any semblance of that. So, yeah, I don't know if I've ever mentioned this on this podcast, but I heard it a long time ago, and it's always stuck with me. Is like the idea of like what an unlock Arab numerals were for the world. That you have like Europe through the Dark Ages or centuries working with Roman numerals, which basically prevented them from being able to do like long division, just kind of not possible. And then Arab numerals show up, and and first of all, people aren't adopting Arab numerals because it's like I prefer like racist reasons or something. I guess you wouldn't characterize it that way, but like cultural reasons, you're just like, no, we don't use those Moorish numbers. And they'd been holding themselves back for so long. When we finally did adopt Arab numerals, suddenly it unlocked the ability to do math much more quickly, which has a huge impact on human productivity and cooperation, all sorts of things. And I don't know. I wonder. It's interesting to think about the written language, the different impacts that has.
You mentioned like Arab numerals in the number system, and he does have a little footnote about that, saying that there are kind of infinitely many number systems, and the most complete is where basically where every single number has its own symbol, and then the simplest is essentially binary, and for now, like like for us, probably somebody who mentions binary is like, oh, of course everything is binary, and you see that all the time. But like this is 1942. Nobody, there were no computers. I think Alan Turing was just sort of building, some proto-computer type stuff in World War II at the time, and like it's just interesting to it's cool to see that pop up in something of, that's this old.
Yeah. Well, and also, I mean, in that footnote about binary, he's like, this was invented by Leibniz, which like that was in also the 1600s or 14, like is, a very long time ago, obviously. And this is another shout out to the George Dyson podcast, but he wrote this book, Analogia, where he does have a chapter where he talks a lot about Leibniz and how, to me, it's just absolutely insane that there were people like Borges in the 40s, but then Leibniz and before, who recognized, they're like, oh, with this system, you could describe literally anything. And like, he has an anecdote in Analogia about a guy in New Zealand who gets like a telegraph machine installed. Like he's like somewhere somewhat remote in New Zealand, but he's able to send telegraphs between, to just another city in New Zealand. And he's like, oh, this is amazing. In the future, you'll be able to like pay for things using this and like watch videos on it. Like, I mean, he doesn't call it videos, but like he's describing basically like the internet. And this, I think it was like late 19th century or something like that. And so I don't think my brain is like this, but it's just amazing to me that, yeah, people were able to extrapolate the potential of like binary encoding very early on.
Yeah, I mean, I think Wilkins, in this thing also has some interesting like futurism things. Like he, apparently Borges mentions that he, was talking about, how would you take a trip to the moon? And this is in the 17th century, and transparent beehives, which sounds, very, very fanciful, but.
I know. And we got to the moon, but we haven't figured out the transparent beehive thing yet.
But actually like when a beekeeper has like those, those things on the slats, I mean, are those considered the transparent beehives?
Maybe. Yeah, we should get to the bottom of this. I don't know. Yeah. It's I honestly I haven't thought about this at all. Like I just sort of glossed over that. I'm like, well, this is just a silly guy, like thinking about crazy stuff like transparent beehives. But now that I think about it, like, yeah, I guess the benefit would be like, you don't want to break this thing open unless there's honey in it, if it's worth your time. So maybe that's what they were going after.
Yeah.
Oh man.
Yeah. I mean, one other thing on the language that that struck me, is, one of the, like, I'm always interested in kind of different ways that like words are represented in different languages convey very often the importance of that thing in that language.
Right.
And in software, there's a thing called like Huffman encoding, and like there are various types of, it's a simple form of compression that most other compression is based on, and the kind of the idea is, just typically when you write a letter, it's 8 bits. It's 8, so it's a value of 0 to 256, and like 135 might be E. But so that means that for every E, I'm using the same amount as I'm using for a Q, which shows up much less frequently. And so Huffman encoding basically says, hey, we're going to assign different bit sequences based on the frequency and the probability that something's going to occur. So like E might just be 1 0, and Q might be actually much longer. And if you kind of put this to and if you string this stuff together, you can store a lot less. You store the same information using a lot less actual physical storage. And I think languages do the same thing. They're just they kind of naturally and sort of by what's important. And so like if something is really important, it's not a 7-syllable word.
Right.
And sometimes you can see like in like France, like wine was really important. So like vin is a super simple word.
Right.
In England, ale is also a simple word, and you can, and like it's just interesting by like sort of the really simple one syllable words. You can recognize what's important. I think that was one of the things that it was, I just thought about in this, um, in this, this language is there's no like frequency compression. There's
Right.
no like ability to say, hey, this is more important, so I'm going to make this, um, easier to say or um, easier to think about. And I think
Yeah.
that would make it hard.
Absolutely. I mean, even sort of quite the opposite. You just get a glimpse into the language, but it's if you're starting where day means an element, how often are you just going to like refer to elements? Whereas like deba, so you've doubled the length of the word to explain something that you would actually deal with, which is a flame.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, almost like by design, this language is going to be pretty complicated to speak about all the stuff that you actually want to talk about, unless you were talking about just abstract concepts all the time, like elements.
Yeah, and I think even if you updated it to me, because he had a different idea of what the elements were than we would, these days.
Right.
But if you updated it for the current periodic table of the elements, like there's some of those are a lot more relevant and interesting than others, and if they got sort of basically the same two letters. I mean, we have in our periodic table we have two letters for each one of these, but you're sort of wasting a lot of kind of space.
That's right. Absolutely. Well, actually, so I'm going to keep going through the essay because there's
Sure.
another good joke here. So he explains some other attempts at these kinds of languages. And so one of them, I won't go through the whole thing, but like there's a language from a guy named Bonifacio Soto Sochando where similar scheme, you've got some designed language. So imaba means building, and then subsequent to that are variations on buildings, so different kinds of buildings. And so the first one, it's like there's imaba, which is a building. Imaka is a harem. So it's like first type of building you think of as a harem. Then imafe is a hospital. Imafo is a pest house, which I don't know what that is. Imari as a house, etc. And anyhow, this just goes to your point as well, is that like encoded in these languages is going to be some notion of like prioritization or importance, maybe. And yeah, is like what is the most important type of building?
Yeah,
is it
no,
a harem? Yeah.
I noticed that as well, and
Yeah.
actually, I think the translation that I had, um, the was brothel for the instead of harem.
Okay.
Um, actually, I was
Yeah.
and I think it's sort of like, oh well, that's the like that's the most important type of house, I guess, for some
For this guy. Yeah.
some individuals.
Yeah.
uh,
Well,
yeah, it was that was quite funny, and also shows like the hey, if you are not entirely clear, you could be sending somebody to the entirely wrong kind of place.
that's right. Yeah, that's right. Whereas like there's no mistake between brothel or harem or building or hospital in our language. So there's one great insight here then after this, like where he sort of explains how, so this kind of language it would be, despite what we said in terms of it being inefficient and not practically useful as a language that humans would speak, every character would have meaning. It would be very significant. And if children are raised speaking this language, they would just, I mean, it would be the way that we were raised speaking the languages we speak. You'd sort of take it for granted, but then later they could realize that it was like, he has this beautiful line. Like later at school, they would discover that it was also a universal key and a secret encyclopedia. So that you could have, the language would be this kind of like universe that you could explore and potentially learn how to wield it to describe anything in the universe. That's the theory, at least. But then we're
I
going
guess
to get
that's
to
I mean that's just an interesting idea that it doesn't just not just as sort of a fixed set of things that we know about, but also when you see something new, like the word for it maybe entirely apparent. Like you have a way of naming things that you've never seen before,
Right.
which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, if you see, for example, I've seen a yellow watermelon. Looks like a watermelon, but it's yellow inside. It's like, okay, there'd be like a special word for that. That isn't just yellow watermelon. But anyway. Okay, so moving on. He goes into a little bit of sort of the how complex everything gets in terms of the categorizations. And so he describes just sort of the limitations of these 40 categories and takes, for example, looking at the 8th category, which is stones, and how complex it gets. He talks about metal, and then he talks about the whale. And apparently the whale belongs to the 16th category. And the way the whale is defined in this language, because again, like the language has to define, like it's built to design like categories and subcategories and species and this and that. And so the whale is classified as a viviparous oblong fish. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but like another translation I saw was like a brooding oblong fish. So, okay. And it's so funny because the thing is like the word whale is a symbol for what you and I consider a whale. And there are many different kinds of whales. And to me, it sounds kind of like a joke to describe it in such a way because it's not poetic enough to me. But also like whale is just an arbitrary sound that we make that to me conjures all sorts of imagery. But so whatever this word is that it would be in the language that would, could be extrapolated to mean a viviparous oblong fish would potentially contain all the poetry that whale does for me. But it just doesn't feel right. It feels really silly in the way it's presented here.
Well, I think also just as whales were considered fish in the 17th century, and now we would classify them differently. And does that mean that, as you learn more, you need to actually change the language? Like, would the word for whale to, have to change from, viviparous oblong fish to viviparous oblong, like mammalian swimming thing, or like,
yeah. Yes, I think the answer is yes. Well, and there's a book I read a long time ago, maybe a couple of years ago. It just came out. It's called Why Fish Don't Exist. Very interesting book. Also along these lines, it's about it's a bit of a like historical scandal. It's about the first president of Stanford, who was basically a pioneer of like eugenics, but he was an early disciple of Darwinism, and was very interested in taxonomizing the world. And the punchline of the book, it's sort of a bit of a spoiler. I mean, it's in the title. It's just that like you can't really classify fish. Like it's like the category of fish as a thing is really not very stable because we have mammals and there are all sorts of fish that share DNA with land mammals and all sorts of things. So like creating these classifications is basically impossible. It's the book is a longer meditation on this story in a lot of ways.
But I think one of the interesting things is that, so creating good taxonomies are hard.
Yes.
And that's something, definitely, and as a software engineer, you kind of see is like, hey, I'm going to divide these things into X and Y, and then it seems obvious, and then you kind of dig into the details, and it's like, oh, well, actually, this one is over here, but kind of it shares a lot of properties of this, and like, you're creating classes of objects and things, and you want to have something that acts like this other thing sometimes. You kind of mentioned, speaking of animals and the animal taxonomy, like it is one of the things that, we now with genetics and kind of like, we can kind of tell, there is a historical lineage of everything, and you can kind of, do a good job of actually, let's say you like the whatever the the 7-part name, or maybe there's more or less now, but like of a species, like that's actually encoded in that is the history of that species as generally distinct from everything else. And I guess, things that are adjacent can be, there can be, I guess, sort of some blurry lines. But
Yeah.
it's an amazing tool that, like, didn't exist until pretty recently.
Oh, sorry. What tool?
I mean, so,
The
like, this taxonomy, like Linnea, so like genetics, I think
Yeah.
is like, and how, I guess Linnea started. I think it was, did he kind of propose the taxonomy, and like it's been sort of refined over the years. But like,
Yeah.
um, if accept that, evolution and that things have evolved, like there is an actual taxonomy, like
Yeah.
it should be stable. Even though, like, a whale might look like a fish, like you can definitely see from this taxonomy that they occupy very different,
That's right.
segments of that tree.
That's right. Right. And also it's extensible or otherwise, the taxonomy has affordances to be updated and things to be moved around. We saw this when Pluto was downgraded from being a planet.
Delisted.
Delisted. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so but this is the part of the essay where he starts going into basically how still, like, any taxonomy does start to fall apart, because you go into the details of certain stones or metals, or also the whale is a good example of things that's just like, these things are somewhat harder to categorize. Like they don't fit neatly into the categories. And he says this reminds us of this the celestial emporium of benevolent knowledge, which is the name of this encyclopedia, and which is also a very interesting turn in the essay because it's not a real thing. He just makes this up. He attributes it to Franz Kuhn, who I looked up in the Wikipedia article about this essay. Franz Kuhn, I think, is a translator that he knew or something. I might get that wrong. Anyhow, so yes, these are the categories of animals according to the Celestial Emporium of Benevolent Knowledge. And I'm going to read them all because they're so funny. A, belonging to the emperor. B, embalmed. C, trained. D, piglets. E, sirens. F, fabulous. G, stray dogs. H, included in this classification, which I'll just pause there. That's amazing. It's like, included in which classification? Like that of the
It's true.
encyclopedia, or is like H a different category? No one knows. I, trembling like crazy. I'll just translate this from the Spanish. I'm looking at the one that has the translation side by side. I would translate this like those that shake like crazy things, or like crazy people, but trembling like crazy. J, innumerables. K, drawn with a very fine camel hair brush. L, etc. M, just broke the vase. N, from a distance look like flies. And it's just a very funny list. But the first one also goes to a point that I think you made earlier of how language and how we decide to classify things, all like it is almost inevitably imbued with some degree of prioritization and like what matters. And so this is describing a world where like whatever belongs to the emperor is pretty important. So, but you've dealt with this list for a long time. How has it been useful to you in your career?
I don't know. I love the list. I was actually asking my wife, like, which one do you think you are, and which one do you think that I am?
Oh yeah, I didn't think about that.
Which one would you be?
Are you asking me right now?
Yes, yeah. Which one would you be?
I want to say fabulous, but maybe trembling like crazy. Yeah.
Yeah,
probably C. I've been trained. I think that's probably the most accurate.
Yeah, I think for my wife it was mermaids, but
yeah.
she loves the water. But
oh yeah, sirens. Yeah, so yeah, that's a
I have a different translation that says mermaids, but it's mermaid sirens.
Yeah,
I guess, what is it in Spanish?
Sirenas. So yeah, it's a direct translation there that I'm looking at.
Yeah, and I just think like yeah, those. There was another translation that I saw that was like those that from a long way off look like flies. Like I
Yeah.
just there's something just sort of poetic about some of these that I just sort of really like. And Yeah, it's certainly absurd, and I've certainly seen like code that tries to that feels like this,
Yes.
I feel like I can like in a code review send send somebody this like, oh, this reminds me of this celestially important benevolent knowledge. Maybe there's another way to think about some of these things.
Yeah. No, I mean this actually brings up that joke about the hard things in software, which are like cache and validation and naming things. It's the same sort of problem space, which is like coming up with categories is extremely hard, and that's the very funny joke being told here.
Although
Yeah,
the version of the joke I like is there's only two hard things in software: um, cache and validation, naming things, and off by one errors.
right. Okay.
But
Just gets
yeah,
better.
yeah. I
Yeah,
mean, what you name things is super important, and making sure that as you learn more or as things change, that it's that it's you're not going to have to reevaluate.
yeah, yeah. Well, and this is, I mean, as a technologist, right? As somebody who does like code review, that's like part of your responsibility uh, to be like, hey, like to figure out, have we thought hard enough about these categories or not? Because yeah, it is so easy to give up at some point,
And I
and it
think
gets harder
as
to
a data
fix things. Yeah,
person, like
yeah,
taxonomies and ontologies are super important, and I imagine you probably encounter that as well. And like, um, what are the categories of things, and like, and every time you try to get into like actually trying to have an ontology of like saying like what are these, so for example, like what are these numbers, like is are these phone numbers, are these social security numbers, are they credit card numbers, are they once basically you end up um, it sounds simple as you start to enumerate some of these things, and then it just sort of gets messier and messier, and then you throw up your hands, and you're like, all right, I just don't want to. I don't want to have to do this. Uh, I there's a couple of different attempts to sort of do class of I guess the semantic web
yeah.
relies heavily on ontologies. Is that something you're familiar with?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Schema.org, for example, tries to define a lot of schemas for different things in the world. And it's very much this exercise. It's a lot what we're describing here, and it's a big part of our work. Is we do really, yeah, very much believe that like well, I'll back up a little bit. The stated mission of Radiant Earth, the nonprofit that I run, my day job, is to increase shared understanding of our world. And then, so the way we do that is by making data easier to access and use. But a big part of that is just like, hey, can we all get on the same page about like what are the things that we're talking about in the world? So we've been, for example, looking at farm field boundaries as a challenge, because you can see farm field boundaries from space, but like how you represent a farm field boundary in data, like everyone has kind of like different approaches to how to do it, like how you would encode those polygons, and the file formats you would use, and the schemas, like how you would define like what the boundary is in the schema. Would you call it a farm field? You wouldn't, but like all that sort of stuff, like it would really help if everybody used the same language. And we actually wrote a blog post a few months ago, kind of laying out a lot of the stuff. I'll put it in the show notes. Thank you, by the way, for giving me a chance to talk about my job. Like, where we point out, we're like, just here in Washington State, I looked up 3 different counties that are next to each other. I pulled it up here. It's like King County, Snohomish County, and Pierce County. they all share parcel data. So data about, again, parcels of land within the county. And King County calls parcels, the column name is PIN, which I assume stands for parcel identification number or something like that. Pierce, they have a column named parcel num, and Snohomish is called parcel ID. And so right there, like we're all, like we all speak the same language. A lot of people probably like go to conferences together and stuff like that. We have a lot of sort of shared understanding with one another in terms of like the problems that we're trying to solve, et cetera. But we can't agree on like what to call this column name, and that creates a ton of friction in terms of making data interoperable. And so that's a long way of saying like, yes, absolutely. We think about this stuff all the time, and it's hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things that I wanted to bring up about this essay, and I think it's something you mentioned yesterday when we were kind of talking through it, and is sort of the relationship with, or the concepts that come up in AI.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that. I have my own thoughts, but I wanted to hear what you were thinking.
Oh man, no, so much. I mean, this essay is great to read in today's context, where suddenly we live in this world where we have these large language models that we can interact with, and just something really remarkable has happened in terms of like we can see now how software and structured data can really mimic human language, or at least English language. I've never tried to work with a model in other languages. And it just, it kind of boggles the mind, right? Because I use ChatGPT maybe like once a week or something like that. It's a useful thought part. I mostly have it write code for me. I was having it write CloudFormation templates for me earlier today. And it's just making me like wonder, like, what, how important language is for consciousness, how important language is for how I navigate the world, and whether or not it's special. And part of me, in a post ChatGPT world, part of me wants to think like, oh wow, like we're just making these mouth noises probabilistically, and like machines can too, and there's not that much to it. But then another part of me is like, well, that's consciousness, and the human experience is much more than just language. Mm-hmm. And so there's only one other thing I guess I would share that I think is interesting, that's relevant to this essay, is that you can encode a lot of information into tokens, right? Like we do it with words, and the meaning of those things is revealed through sentences and context. But going back to the whole whale thing as being like, of whether or not it is a viviparous oblong fish or not, the idea is that you have a word that you can have a lot of data attached to that word, or to that symbol, or that token, or whatever you call it. And in my world, where I think a lot about shared schemas and common identifiers for things, I'm really interested in what large language models are going to be able to do with what in my mind, have just come up with this term super tokens, which are things like a URL could be a super token, and that like it points to a lot of content, mm-hmm. or an ISBN, which is that the International Standard Book Number or something like that. But an ISBN is a token, something resembling a word, a string of text that means a whole book, and there's a lot of data attached to that. And I think as large language models are able to see through those tokens to more data, it's going to be very interesting. So that's a bit of a rant. Over to you.
I think I was sort of struck by the kind of the resemblance to tokens that, as this analytical language, as you put these, basically each individual letter or each individual kind of element or something, just sort of reminded me of tokens in, that you use, as inputs or outputs to these LLMs. And that I think the other thing that it sort of started reminding me of is that, like, this is an attempt to define a universal language. And I kind of feel like what an LLM is doing is is actually the structure, the encoding of that LLM is effectively a universal language. I remember, so I worked at
Hmm.
Google for a long time, and I remember the Google Translate team. It's like they started out the Google Translate. If you wanted to translate, cat from like English to French, there was basically a list of like this is what cat means or this is what cat is in chat in French,
Yeah.
and it was like it was like a language X to language Y dictionary. And to do that, you
Yeah.
have to basically have these sort of lists of correspondences. And then as like they're starting to build these machine learning languages, they actually realize that um, instead of having individual X to Y, is that they had built these neural networks that had really encoded what that thing is,
Yeah.
and could make the translations from language A to language B without having a direct concordance. So it could be Swahili to Chinese, and nobody had ever sort of maybe written a direct concordance, but because there is some underlying node that is
Yeah.
that is cat, or
Right.
is and I think where it gets interesting is that we tend to think about language as distinct entities, and for nouns maybe that's true, but for verbs, for adjectives, like there's very often things in one language that can't be sort of, there's no actual exact word for something in a different language, and this neural network actually can encode like what those things actually are that are actually meaningful. And so in order to translate from X to Y, you can't just, there's not one word. You may have to come up with a phrase or something else. And anyway, just it did remind me of like, this is sort of like, you can, and this is where I'm getting very, very hand wavy. But if you think about like coordinate spaces, like can be defined by a
Right.
matrix, and you can actually kind of come up with there may be multiple different ways of representing the matrix that are just sort of rotations of that matrix. And this sort of, I think
Right.
it's sort of like different languages as sort of rotations of sort of it's not a two-dimensional matrix, it's a multi-dimensional graph of like of knowledge and language. And
Yeah.
and that there might, and then and there's also this concept of an eigenvector, is basically you have like kind of the sort of the natural way of representing things, and like sort of is there something that we could mine from these neural networks that is sort of the sort of the quintessential human language. And I'm totally out of my depth here and make and hand waving, but like I don't know, it's just something that made me that this essay made me think about.
Yeah. No, this is awesome because yeah, this is exactly like kind of the point of the podcast is to like read crazy stuff like this, and it can hopefully nudge your mind in an interesting direction. Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, like this is, I think, one of the interesting things about, I guess, transformer models. Are they? Is a transformer? Is it unsupervised? It's just sort of like you point the model at a huge corpus of data, and you're just like figure stuff out.
Then they do
That
semi-supervised, and they end up. But yeah, it starts out as sort of all
yeah.
unsupervised learning.
Um, but the idea being like, yeah, like with enough compute power, these sort of models, they could, to bring it back to the essay, they could figure out what the 40 categories are, right? Like this.
Yeah.
And am I right that what you're describing, the space you're describing, this multidimensional matrix, would that be what embeddings are? Do you know? I don't know.
Effectively, yeah. I mean, there's
Okay.
there's the well, there's the um, I think it's one way thinking about that. I think the embeddings are yeah. I think that's exactly.
Okay. I I'm also hand waving here. So
Yes.
um no, but anyway, I think the insight that remains is this idea that like it is very hard for us to parse our own language or the own sort of universe that we're able to describe with the language that we have and figure out what the categories might be. But yeah, looking at many human languages and looking at these spaces, like the way you described the Google Translate team was able to do, that does seem to me to indicate that, like, yeah, we might be able to get better insight into what the actual categories are, you know. And then, well, let's skip ahead because there's too much here, but I'm going to skip to this this quote from Chesterton that he ends with, and we can go back up because there's some other stuff I want to talk about. But he's it's very funny. So Chesterton wrote about language, and by the way, for the listeners, you're hearing seaplanes taking off outside of Jordan's office, which is cool. It's what Seattle's like. Okay. So Chesterton wrote, he knows that there are in the soul tints more bewildering, more numberless, and more nameless than the colors of an autumn forest. Yet he seriously believes that these things can, every one of them, in all their tones and semitones and all their blends and unions, be accurately represented by an arbitrary system of grunts and squeals. He believes that an ordinary civilized stockbroker can really produce out of his own inside noises which denote all the mysteries of memory and all the agonies of desire, which is just so awesome. Like, yeah, it's hilarious that we think that these sounds we're making are like actually describing reality. But then what makes me think about what we were just talking about is like, oh no, but we have embeddings that can tell us what shame actually is. like, or whatever it is, you know.
Yeah.
Any complex human emotion.
And then we can then, the interesting thing is how you put them together. I think this language is so focused on words, but where the world gets interesting is when you string those words together. And you can see that, like, you don't need that many words to convey important things. Like, I think the original Twitter was like 140 characters, and it seems like that's not a lot to be able to actually get a thought across. And in fact, that turned out to be enough to describe so many different things. And that maybe we don't need a specialized analytical language if what we have is already pretty good.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, yeah. And I think for our purposes, probably, yeah, infinitely good. Like, we'll be able to do more than enough with it. You reminded me of Hemingway's like famous 6-word story, which is just horrible, but for sale, baby shoes never used. And it's just like, I'm going to start crying. Like, just like, that's 6 words, there's a whole story there. And yeah, our language is incredible, but yet again, like there's so much to the experience that like we're never going to be able to like properly document, Yeah. The mysteries of memory and the agonies of desire. That's a great phrase. And then also, yeah, let me go back up to the idea that, so like he spent some time, going through these different like failed attempts at creating these languages, and like to the point of like taxonomy, it's like how everybody sort of eventually gives up and is like, yeah, we don't know what category certain things fit into. But then he says it very, very beautifully, and he's like, the reason this is hard is very simple. It's because we don't know what thing the universe is. So we're even like our starting point is kind of impossible because we live within something that we consider a universe, but we don't really know what it is. And so as a starting point, it's really not useful to try to start categorizing whatever's in it.
Although, I mean, I think, I wouldn't throw up my hands that easily, because we do know a lot more than we did before. And I think there's sort of this like, there's another process in software and machine learning called simulated annealing, which simulates the annealing of a crystal. And basically the idea is that kind of as things at the beginning, that basically the temperature is very high, and basically everything is kind of movable, and everything can change. And sort of as you know more, it gets more rigid, and sort of the temperature cools, and the changes that you make are going to be smaller and more localized. And I think, as knowledge goes, like I think we get started out from thinking, hey, the first element is fire,
Right.
and vert to this point where, like, all right, well, we're pretty sure what these elements are. Like, hydrogen is not going to really change to something different. Yeah, maybe there's some out in the way, the very bottom right corner of the periodic table that we're still discovering, or maybe there's still some like mysteries that we haven't figured out. But in
Yeah.
general, I mean, we know the atomic weight's to like 17 digits of precision. The things that we're going to be changing are reducing, or at least we think that they're, most likely they're going
Yeah.
to be reducing. So kind of as you get, more collective knowledge, maybe you can start to believe more about the universe.
Well, yeah. I mean, this is where I think we can say, like, Borges didn't know about computers, right? Like, what was so cool about the way he wrote was that he was thinking about all the possibilities, but like probably didn't have. I mean, and he had a concept of like massive data storage, which is the Library of Babel. Like but it was in these like really old, like sort of analog concepts that just weren't feasible. And so similarly, like this passage from Chesterton, that like the sounds that we're able to make are not sufficient to the task of describing actual reality. But, and I'm going to harken back to another previous episode of the podcast, the first one with Tim O'Reilly, where Tim O'Reilly, he's like, our job as humans is to transcend our limits. And I think you said the magic word is something around like enough shared knowledge, or but my point being, this is a cooperative thing that we do as a species.
Yes.
The idea that John Wilkins was going to do it is kind of funny.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, back over to you. I love this. I mean, annealing, what a cool word.
I also, the other thing I like about the essay is just like, it's towards an analytical language, and like, that's what my life is about, is like analytical language. And, like, it's okay. It's before SQL, was ever invented, which is, what, the analytical language that pretty much everybody in data uses these days. But, he's, talking about that 400 years or 300 years or whatever ahead of Edgar Codd inventing the relational algebra.
Yeah. The humans are amazing. And yeah, these ideas have been around for a long time. I think, we're lucky to live in a time where we're riding this hockey stick up, but a lot of the concepts have existed for quite a while. Can I ask you, I mean, as I would say that a lot of people who want a career in technology would aspire to have a career that looks like yours. I mean, has literature been useful to you? I mean, would you say? I mean, obviously this is fun to think about, but do you think it's been practically useful to you in your work?
I think it has. I think it's it gives you different ways of thinking about the world, and like, and just concretely in Borges, it's like learning about the limits of taxonomies and languages. The Library of Babel is like that you brought up, is also like an obvious one of like these sort of, what if you could have this giant library. The Lottery of Babylon was the other one that I considered talking about, where where it turns out that basically all of human existence can be sort of thought of as a lottery, and there's just sort of a lot of things that in software where you kind of, I don't know, that it comes up over and over again, and kind of having, I think literature can give you a framework to map things you learn about too, that's not just technical. And the other thing is you end up having to, a big part of technology is dealing with people. And as a software engineer, that tends to sometimes, the realization hits hard when you're like, it's not just about like building something really cool. Like if you spend, all this time creating this, 600-page treatise on analytical language, it might turn out that nobody cares. And so
Right.
the important part is you have to actually, relate it to something that people care about and something that people are going to actually want to use. And I think that's where literature being able to sort of communicate well comes in handy. To not always resort to, like, reading good literature is a great way of just sort of realizing how shallow some of my own writing is, and pushes me to do better. Like, the Chesterton quote, like some of these, like, it's just like the richness of this language. You're like, why do I resort to the same cliches, the same like easy, facile things, versus actually something that's meaningful. And it's one thing if you're dashing off an email to a coworker, maybe you want to do the fastest way possible. But if you're trying to get a clear point across, like using interesting and different and surprising richer language can be useful. And I think that's where literature is incredibly useful. I mean, you Shakespeare, for example, I think is, you just all these little phrases that are just remarkably evocative, and you're like, well, why can't I do that? And kind of can push you to be better.
Yeah. I'd say it's good to compare yourself to Shakespeare all the time.
That's a goal. It's like,
yeah. Yeah, no, that's right though. I mean, like the precision of language is so important. And, I spent a long time in Amazon, which is a very strong writing culture. And I wouldn't say it produces much good writing. I would say probably still writing is extremely hard, but sometimes it really does. And I think placing value on it it's been useful to me too. Just one more question along those lines though. Like I'm curious to get sort of other thoughts that you have on the impact of large language models, like on your world, is, what you're building and the future of technology.
I think right now it's really hard to tell. It's almost like this sort of alien artifact has landed, and like it can do a bunch of like extraordinary things, and you're like, oh well, it's going to be able to like change everything. And I think perhaps it will change everything, but it's also like it's still something we're trying to poke and prod and figure out like how it's going to be most useful. Like I've seen how it's changed, how people write code, how people do data, how people interact with data. I don't know that it's going. I mean, I think there's the sort of the maximalists that think that like, oh well, the software engineering job is not going to be around in 10 years, 20 years. But I think that's sort of a reduction of the job of someone who is a software engineer, because I think what coding is, like once you kind of have really internalized how to write code, it's sort of like when someone is really internalizes how to play an instrument. It's like, and it becomes you're fluid, which is it's not magic. But then like writing software is really about writing the specification of what you want to happen. And I think, and you have to be very clear, because if you're not clear, then computers are going to do the wrong thing. Right. And that's, when you have bugs, when you realize you haven't been entirely clear in your thinking but I think that with large language models, like you're still going to have to provide that level of clarity. You're going to, and English is actually a pretty bad way of getting across very clear concepts, which is why legal documents, which are essentially executable code, are so gross and lengthy, because if you want something to actually stand up and be meaningful, and have there's only one interpretation of it, then you have to describe something really horrendous, and code is actually a better way of doing that. So I don't know, like things are changing. It's still like things are moving very quickly. But I think that there's still an artistry that is going to be hard for machines to replicate. But I think probably designers thought that too, and now you can have and musicians, now you can have large language models generating music. All the things that we thought were going to be hard for computers to do, it turns out like are not all that hard. Like art and music and
Yeah.
poetry. Like you can ask your favorite LLM to write a poem about Borges, and like
Yeah.
it'll be a passable, and you can say I want it to be in like a sestina, or I want it to be an iambic pentameter, or like a limerick, and it will do as good a job as like somebody who is actually spend a lot of time and energy on that, and that's pretty extraordinary. So I don't know. We'll see what happens, and when the next generation of models come out, like they're going to be able to do even more things. But I don't know. It's sort of, I feel like we entered a bit of a cloud, and it's sort of, you don't really know what's on the other side of that cloud until you get through it.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally agree. I mean, yeah, we don't know what the business models are. We don't know who's going to survive. Yeah, it's fascinating. But yeah, it does seem to me that there's a new capability. I feel like that's been unlocked, and I think I'm not, the idea of like, these things writing music or poetry or whatever, like what does that mean for humans and like the meaning, of our existence? And I'm like, not that much. Like, I think like the reason things are meaningful to us is like kind of a mystery, and it has more to do with like our like social dynamics, and how we share things with one another. So like, there are poems and songs that are very important to me that like might not be considered to be like good or great or anything like that. And that's fine. But they're important to me because like people shared them with me that matter to me, or I encountered them when I was 12 or, at some age where it hit harder. So yeah, it's just gonna be interesting to see. Like, our future generations might have their favorite songs might be written by some algorithm.
Which could be, or they,
fine.
they just generate a new song every time they want to listen to something. Like,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, completely. That's a good one to think about. Well, let's see. I mean, this has been awesome. We've been going for quite a while. Is there anything else you feel like in the essay that we didn't touch that you wanted to touch on?
No, I think that's pretty much. I guess the last one is this was written in 1942, and just sort of, it's just interesting to have written this in 1942, like when what's going on in the world. Maybe he's in Argentina and like a little bit more isolated from things. Although I don't know what was happening in Argentina and during World War II, but like something is like being able to think deeply about something that is not what else is going on in the world is I guess just interesting.
It is. It's so fascinating. Yeah, and I mean, as much of a fan I am of Borges, I don't know a ton about him as a person, but the episode that I just released like 3 days ago, sometime this week. I mean, so we're recording this on August 2nd. This will come out in September. Anyhow, the episode that we just released with Io Blair Fries, she explained to me, I mean, one thing I did know about Borges is that he went blind later in life, and it was a congenital blindness that he inherited from his dad. So his dad also had gone blind. So Borges knew that he was going to go blind. And there is a theme in a lot of his work of just kind of like this very intense desire to like suck up as much knowledge and information as he could while he could still read. And so that's why, I mean, taking it all the way back to the top, the idea that like, oh, new encyclopedia just dropped, like, let's see what's new, is the kind of thing that he would do. I mean, he's just like very greedy for information.
And also maybe his fascination with Homer, because, the Homer was also blind.
Yeah. So yeah, what a guy. Well, and again, thank you so much for bringing this essay to my attention. I think it's a really good entry point to people. And it's a funny one since it's ostensibly an essay and not a fiction, but it's also a fiction because he makes up this. I mean, oh yeah, sorry. One other thing, just in case you know. So the Celestial Emporium of Benevolent Knowledge is something that he made up. He also refers to the Bibliographic Institute of Brussels. Do you have any idea if that's a real thing or not?
No, but what he describes actually sounds a lot like the Dewey Decimal System. And And so the Dewey Decimal System is a reasonably successful ontology taxonomy that was created a long time ago, and has stood the test of time reasonably well.
Yeah. There's a whole other story there, though, about, are you familiar with like WorldCat?
No.
Okay, so let me look this up really quickly to make sure I don't talk out of school. But I think WorldCat might be the steward of the Dewey Decimal System or something like that. Because like someone has to maintain it. So they describe themselves as the world's largest library catalog, helping you find library materials online. And but what's interesting about WorldCat is that like this catalog for libraries, they tout they've got 405 million books, 440 articles, 25 million sound recordings, etc. So they're flexing these huge numbers, and I think to those of us who've worked in like cloud architectures, like these are not big numbers. Like it's no longer like that exciting. Because we've just, it just kind of happened gradually over time. It's like, like it's not that scary to move a terabyte of data around or 50 gigabytes or something like that. But they were created in the era of like microfilm and stuff like that, where like their work was supremely important. And so the long story short is that WorldCat has been hacked because they do charge for access to their catalog, and people are like, this is very silly. You shouldn't charge access to something like this anymore. It's not big enough to justify the costs, which is interesting. I mean, I won't make any further comment.
Yeah, but I hadn't realized that there was a steward of the Dewey Decimal System, but I guess somebody must keep it up to date, because new ideas and new things come out, and like you have to figure out where it goes. It's probably a really interesting job as like the master taxonomist. Yeah.
No, it's fast. And it's, and the thing is like, I don't begrudge WorldCat. I mean, there's some kind of activist-y people that are just like, hey, like we should liberate this data. But I'm like, but it should also be like someone's job. Like someone should get paid to do this, I think. So anyhow, it's also lots of caveats. I might be somewhat wrong about this, but in broad strokes, that's kind of what's going on, is that there's a steward of these kinds of things.
Very cool.
All right. Well, man, Jordan, thanks so much for taking all the time to do this with me, and maybe we'll have you on again someday.
Yeah, thanks, Chad. Super interesting, and it's always fun to talk about this kind of stuff. I don't get a chance to do that enough. I think these days, people don't talk about ideas and literature as much as they probably should.
I agree. All right. I hope you enjoyed that. I sure did. I got to thank Jordan also for introducing me to the word annealing and the concept of simulated annealing. This is a mind-blowing metaphor for me, this idea of crystal formation and the process whereby things become more solid and structured. It's something I've been thinking a lot about ever since we had this conversation. And anyway, I predict it'll keep rattling around in my head for a long time. But it just goes to show how these conversations can be so fulfilling and enriching. So I just want to thank Jordan again for coming on and giving me the gift of this essay and a lot of the ideas that we discussed. So I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And if you're listening, please subscribe. Please leave a review if you can. Please like it or something on YouTube. There's all sorts of stuff you're supposed to do. I should probably get better at this, but I honestly don't know. I just hear other people say this stuff. So like and subscribe. I think the most important thing for me is just tell a friend. If you find this interesting, share it with somebody else, and and share these texts with other people. That's what I want to do here. So please do that. And then also, if you know anybody who's interested in supporting this kind of thing financially, I don't necessarily want to get paid for this, but I would like to hire an intern to help me with some of this stuff, and I'd like to pay them. So let me know if you know of any grants or anything like that out there, or people who could fund an intern to do something like this. I don't want to ask somebody to work for free. I want them to get paid. So just putting that out there. As always, our intro music is recorded by Secret School, or was created by Secret School. And this outro music is a song called 3/10 of the Population by We. I don't have anything else recorded for the coming months, but we are going to be talking about, I believe, pretty soon, A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin, and then probably Never Let Me Go by... I should know his name. Let me look this up. The famous Japanese English writer, but who has a Japanese name, Kazuo Ishiguro. So we're going to talk about Never Let Me Go, and then potentially the movie Her. So I consider films to be texts, screenplays a text, and I think I love movies. So we might talk about Her as well. But anyway, that's potentially what's coming up. We'll see. No official announcements yet, but regardless, I can recommend all of those things to you as interesting things to read or watch. As always, thank you for listening, and I will see you next month.